A man was convicted for a South Florida park crime, but then there was a twist in the case decades later. Regina Harrison was born on April 30th, 1963. She grew up in Davie, Florida. At just 20 years old, she was still living with her parents and pursuing her studies at Palm Beach Atlantic Junior College. Regina was a kind and thoughtful young woman. She carried her faith close to her heart, often keeping religious pamphlets in her bag, and she had a reputation for being both friendly and trusting. On the afternoon of May 2, 1983, Regina set out for a bicycle ride near her family's home. She pedaled toward the Hollywood Broadwalk, a popular stretch by the beach. That was the last time her family saw her alive. Witnesses later recalled seeing Regina riding alongside a skinny, long-haired man on a black bike, but they could not have known how important that detail would become. The next day on May 3rd, the search for Regina ended in horror. Her body was discovered in Westlake Park in Hollywood, Florida. She had been inappropriately assaulted and strangled. Near the crime scene, the detectives found her bicycle, her neatly folded clothes, her backpack, and the religious pamphlets she often carried. The shocking crime devastated her family and rattled the community. The investigation quickly turned toward finding the man last seen with her. By the summer of 1983, a composite sketch was circulated, and witnesses pointed the police toward Ronald Henry Stewart, a man already known to law enforcement as a serial predator. By March 1984, the following year, a grand jury charged Stewart for Regina's death. Stewart insisted he was innocent of the crime, but his criminal history worked against him. Facing the possibility of the death penalty, he accepted a plea deal. On January 28, 1985, he entered a no-contest plea to second-degree murder in Regina's case and was sentenced to 50 years in prison. The sentence ran at the same time as others he was already serving for multiple inappropriate assaults. For the justice system, the case was closed. For Regina's family, however, questions lingered. For more than 2 decades, Stewart lived behind bars, maintaining his innocence in Regina's case until he died in 2008 due to cancer in prison. By then, new forensic methods like DNA profiling were transforming the way cold cases were solved, and Stewart's conviction began to look increasingly shaky. The truth came from an unexpected source. Jack Harold Jones, a convicted criminal and predator serving time in Arkansas, had built his own dark legacy of violence. In 1995, he inappropriately assaulted and took the life of Mary Phillips, a crime that earned him the death sentence. While awaiting execution, Jones began reflecting on his crimes. Before his death in 2017, he wrote a letter to his sister confessing to the crime of Regina Harrison back in 1983. He instructed her not to deliver the letter until a year after he passed away. When the letter was finally handed over to the Florida detectives in 2018, the investigators reopened Regina's case. They tested preserved evidence with modern DNA methods, and the results were undeniable. The DNA matched Jack Harold Jones, not Ronald Stewart. In 2019, more than 35 years after Regina's death, the Broward County prosecutors officially exonerated Stewart. They acknowledged that he had been wrongfully convicted based on flawed eyewitness identification and circumstantial evidence. His name was cleared posthumously, though he had not lived to see justice done. For Regina's family, the exoneration brought mixed emotions. On one hand, the truth about her real criminal had finally come out. On the other, decades had been lost to a wrongful conviction, and the man responsible for Regina's brutal murder, Jack Harold Jones, had already been executed for another crime. A missing Indiana man's case was finally solved. After 2 decades, the truth finally came out, not because of a confession, but because of a curious family member, a genealogy website, and a long-buried secret that could no longer hide. On February 10, 1993, in Indianapolis, Indiana, Richard Hoagland picked up the phone and called his wife, Linda. His words were hurried and vague. "I am not feeling well. I am going to the emergency room." Linda offered to go with him, but he said he did not have time to wait for her to go with him. Linda waited for hours. Richard never came home. When she called the local hospitals, none had a record of him checking in. His car was not found and there was no note. His toothbrush was still there. He did not pack any clothes. It was cold. It was in February. He did not take a coat. He did not even take his passport. Their son Matthew was 9 years old at the time, and his brother Doug was just 6 years old. Just like that, Richard, a husband and father of 2 boys, was gone. Linda said he was very spontaneous. He was a go-getter and a risk-taker. He was always doing things, making deals and doing stuff. He was very successful. He was a lot of fun to be with. The family had a big house, a steady income, and exotic vacations. The police were brought in. At first, foul play was suspected, but when the investigators dug deeper, they discovered something far stranger. Richard did not just vanish. He had emptied joint bank accounts, taken important documents, and even left behind clues suggesting this was no random disappearance. He left Linda struggling to pay bills and to raise their children alone. The authorities eventually found Richard's car abandoned at Indianapolis International Airport, but there was no record of him taking any flights out of the airport the day he went missing. That summer, his two sons both received a birthday card from their father, each containing $50. Doug's card said, "Maybe sometime soon we will get to see each other. I bet I will not even know you. It has been so long. Mind your mother. Bye, Dad." Those words were the last they ever heard from him. Linda lost the house and cars after he vanished. Her mother stepped in to help. As the months turned into years, the truth became clearer. Richard was not taken. He chose to disappear. After 10 years, Richard was declared dead. Linda eventually moved on and remarried. What no one in Indiana knew was that Richard had headed to Florida, where he pulled off something few could imagine. He stole another man's identity. The identity belonged to a fisherman named Terry Szymanski, who had passed away in 1991 at the age of 33. By digging through public records, Richard found Terry's birth certificate and used it to rebuild his life. As Terry, Richard married again. He had a child. He bought property, held jobs, and lived as if nothing had ever happened in Indiana. For more than 2 decades, he lived a second life, hidden in plain sight. The deception finally began to crumble in 2016 when Terry's real nephew started building a family tree online. While researching, he stumbled across something bizarre: records showing that Terry Szymanski had remarried years after he had passed away. Alarmed, the nephew contacted the authorities and an investigation was launched. The investigation revealed the truth. The man living in Florida as Terry Szymanski was in fact Richard Hoagland, missing since 1993. Richard was arrested, charged with identity theft, and faced the family he had abandoned decades earlier. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison. For Linda and her sons, the news brought a mix of emotions. Relief, anger, sadness, all blended together. For years, they had lived with questions, wondering what had happened to their loved one. The answers were devastating. He had walked away, rebuilt his life, and started a new family while leaving his first family behind. On May 14, 2018, a judge ordered Richard to pay $1.86 million in back child support. In 1985, a mother and 2 of her daughters were brutally murdered in their home. It would take over 20 years and 3 trials before their criminal would be brought to justice. In the spring of 1985, Fayetteville, North Carolina was a place where families left their doors unlocked, children played freely in front yards, and neighbors watched out for one another. It was also home to Captain Gary Eastburn, his wife Katie, and their 3 little girls, 5-year-old Cara, 3-year-old Erin, and 22-month-old Jonna. On May 7, 1985, Gary kissed his family goodbye and boarded a plane for England. He was heading overseas for a temporary training assignment with the Air Force, leaving Katie to care for the children. It was not unusual for him to be gone, but this time fate had something unspeakable waiting. Since the Eastburn family was planning to relocate to England so that Gary could take up a liaison job with the Royal Air Force, Katie made arrangements to rehome the family's dog, Dixie. She had placed an ad in the paper to find a new home for Dixie. Within days, a man named Timothy Hennies, a 27-year-old Army sergeant from nearby Fort Bragg, showed up at her door to take the dog. Their interaction was brief, ordinary, at least on the surface. Neither Katie nor her daughters could have known this was the beginning of their end. By May 10th, the newspapers began to pile up at the end of the Eastburn driveway. A neighbor, Catherine Strickland, began to feel a knot in her stomach. Something was wrong. The following day, on May 11th, silence filled the Eastburn home. No one had seen Katie, and the girls were not playing outside. The blinds were drawn. Katie also did not respond to her husband Gary's routine phone call. That next day, the neighbors could no longer ignore the signs. They called the police to request a welfare check. When the officers stepped into the Eastburn home, the stench was immediate. Upstairs, they found Katie in her bedroom, unclothed from the waist down, brutally, inappropriately assaulted and stabbed 15 times. Just down the hall, 5-year-old Cara was found stabbed repeatedly in the chest, and 3-year-old Erin had been bludgeoned in the chest and back. each fatally stabbed repeatedly as they slept and their throats slashed. Incredibly, 22-month-old Jonna was still alive in her crib, weak but clinging to life after being left for days without food or water. She had survived what her mother and sisters could not. The sight shocked even hardened investigators. This was not just a murder, it was a massacre. While combing the house, the investigators found fingerprints and hair. A luminol test of the walls and master bathroom indicated that somebody had tried unsuccessfully to clean up the crime scene. After returning to Fayetteville, Gary helped the detectives identify missing items, including an envelope of cash, Katie's ATM card, and a piece of paper containing her ATM password. The investigators believe that the crime happened between 8:00 p.m. on May 9th and 3:00 a.m. on May 10th. The detectives, desperate to find the criminal, even turned to baby Jonna, the only survivor, to see if there were clues she could offer. They brought in child psychologist Helen Brantley to question Jonna and show her pictures of her family and police photo lineups. According to her summary report, she was not certain that Jonna had seen what happened that night, but had clearly heard things. Still, it was nothing that could conclusively help the investigation. Although baby Jonna could not help, in the days after the crime, the police found someone who could. A young man came forward and said that he saw a white male leaving the Eastburns' home near Fort Bragg at 3:30 that morning. A tall white man dressed in jeans, a knit cap, and a black members-only jacket exiting the Eastburns' driveway carrying a garbage bag. In the early morning hours of May 10th, the man drove away in a white Chevrolet Chevette. The investigators also found a bloody sneaker print at the scene. The witness helped the police to create a composite sketch of the suspect. The detectives soon learned of the dog adoption and focused on Timothy Hennies. On May 15th, just 3 days after the bodies were discovered, Hennies was arrested and charged with inappropriate assault and 3 counts of murder. In 1986, a jury convicted Hennies and he was sentenced to the death penalty. But the case would not end there. In 1988, the North Carolina Supreme Court overturned the conviction, ruling that the jury had been unfairly influenced by graphic crime scene photographs. At his second trial in 1989, Hennies was acquitted. He walked free, returned to the Army, and went on to serve honorably, even retiring as a master sergeant in 2004. For years, it seemed that the Eastburn case might never find justice. By the early 2000s, forensic science had advanced. In 2006, the investigators retested male DNA evidence preserved from the crime scene. The results were chilling. The DNA belonged to Timothy Hennies. Though the Fifth Amendment's double jeopardy clause prohibits retrials after acquittal, the United States Constitution's dual sovereignty doctrine allows a defendant tried and acquitted in a state court to be retried at a federal court. In addition, the Uniform Code of Military Justice permits military personnel tried in a civilian court to be court-martialed. At the request of the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office, Lieutenant General John R. Vines, the commanding officer at Fort Bragg, agreed to recall the retired Hennies back into service as a reason for charging him with the Eastburn case based on the new DNA evidence. On September 26, 2006, Hennies was recalled to military duty and returned to Fort Bragg the following month, quitting his job at the waste treatment plant in the process. In August 2007, the commander of the 18th Airborne Corps ordered that Hennies be court-martialed on 3 counts of premeditated murder. In December, Hennies appealed this decision because the Army lacked jurisdiction, but this petition was denied in April 2008. In May, Hennies appealed against the court-martial decision at the United States Army Court of Criminal Appeals, but it was dismissed the following month. In September, Hennies appealed to the United States Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, but this was dismissed. In December 2009, Hennies appealed against the court-martial at the United States District Court for the Eastern District of North Carolina, but this was also rejected. In March 2010, Hennies' court-martial at Fort Bragg began on March 17, 2010 and lasted for 3 weeks. For the court-martial, Hennies enlisted the services of military lawyer Frank Spinner and 2 uniformed lawyers. The prosecution was represented by Army captains Matt Scott and Nathan Huff. Colonel Patrick Parrish presided over the court-martial proceedings, while a jury panel of 14 military officers and non-commissioned personnel was convened. During the trial, the prosecution focused on the DNA evidence with the prior eyewitness accounts as supporting evidence. Spinner's defense team argued that the footprints, blood, and hair samples found at the crime scene did not match Henny's or the victim's. In addition, they suggested that the crime scene evidence at the former Eastburn family home in Fayetteville had been contaminated. In response to the DNA evidence, Spinner suggested that Henny's had consensual intercourse with Katie before her death. Henny's himself denied having ever had intercourse with Katie, consensually or otherwise. Following 3 hours of deliberation, the jury unanimously found Henny's guilty. On April 3, 2010, the jury convicted him once again, and on April 8, 2010, he was sentenced again to the death penalty. Henny's remains on death row at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Baby Jonna, the only survivor, grew up with the knowledge that she was spared, while her mother and sisters were taken in the most brutal way imaginable. The case of a baby that was stolen in San Diego was finally solved. Dorothy Anzaldi and Jeff Anzaldi moved to Corning briefly in 1987, and on March 20th, they became the parents of Kendra Joyce. Soon after the couple returned to Oregon 2 years later, Dorothy delivered baby Crystal Leanne during an emergency C-section at Tillamook Community Hospital. Jeff joined the U.S. Navy, and the family moved to San Diego, where he served as a radio man. Having some financial problems, the family was temporarily living in the bottom of a 2-story house in San Diego's Golden Hill neighborhood. A friend of Dorothy told her about the house. The owner was supposed to be entering a rehabilitation center, and the Anzaldis could stay rent-free in exchange for taking care of her 3 children and doing some housekeeping. The truth was darker. The owner was heading to prison on a drug charge. The neighbors recalled seeing strangers constantly coming and going from the house, which the police said was frequented by methamphetamine users. Dorothy said that the 3 children she cared for each had different fathers who came and went as they pleased through the apartment. Dorothy, Jeff, 3-year-old Kendra, and 14-month-old Crystal were sleeping together in the same bed on the morning of December 8, 1990, when the toddler disappeared. Jeff woke up about 7:00 a.m. and covered Crystal as she was sleeping. When he woke up again about an hour later, the chubby, sandy-haired baby was gone. As he searched for her, he noticed that the front door and a door leading to an upstairs apartment were ajar. Dorothy said she ran from room to room, screaming, yelling, "Crystal." She ran around the block, went through the whole house, leaving no stone unturned. Neither did the police nor neighbors who joined in the search. They scoured the neighborhood, checking garbage bins, garages, inside homes. Helicopters swarmed over Golden Hill, blaring from loudspeakers, baby in diapers missing. Nothing. The neighbors said that the day's chaos and terror still haunt them. Then in 1997, at the age of 8, Crystal was recovered. It was not by chance. Her discovery came through a mix of suspicion, paperwork checks, and investigation into the false identity she had been living under. While living in Puerto Rico under the name Sonia Guzman, Crystal was enrolled in school and had an official-looking birth certificate, but that document had been forged by Nilza Gervillini Guzman. The authorities eventually uncovered irregularities in her paperwork. The falsified birth certificate did not fully match records in Puerto Rico's system. Once the forgery was flagged, the investigators dug deeper and realized that Sonia was actually Crystal Anzaldi, a child listed as missing from California since 1990. Crystal was taken into custody, and after confirming her true identity through investigative records, she was reunited with her biological father, Jeff, in Oregon. The motive behind her disappearance, or how she disappeared, remained a mystery. The only thing that was known is that Gervillini Guzman was in possession of Crystal in Puerto Rico, and that she left San Diego with her on December 21, 1990. Guzman had lived in San Diego about 2 years when the child disappeared. The investigators said that she apparently knew people who frequented the Anzaldi's house, but did not know the couple. At the time, Guzman was married to Darrell Graham, who was in the Navy, but assigned to a different ship than Jeff. Graham had been away at sea and in Saudi Arabia for some time before returning home in December 1990. In an interview, Graham said that when he returned, Guzman claimed to have given birth to the baby, but refused to say who the father was. Realizing it was not his, Graham booked his wife on a plane to her native Puerto Rico, and they divorced. Guzman was charged and convicted for falsifying Crystal's birth certificate. However, she is not convicted of kidnapping due to challenges in the legal case. The limited conviction leaves Crystal's family frustrated, feeling that full justice has not been served. A 1996 Virginia cold case has been solved a decade after the crime took place. In May 1996, the police in Virginia Beach responded to a horrifying scene inside a quiet home. Elise Makdessi, a 27-year-old Navy air traffic controller, was found tied to her bed, her throat cut, and she was stabbed multiple times. Lying nearby was Quincy Brown, another Navy sailor that was fatally shot. At first, the detectives struggled to make sense of it, but as they dug deeper, they uncovered a tangled story of lies, money, and betrayal. Just days before her death, Elise made a videotape accusing fellow sailors, including Quincy Brown, of harassing and inappropriately assaulting her. Sitting beside her was her husband, Eddie Makdessi, who appeared to be supporting her. But the investigators later came to believe that the tape was part of a bigger plan. The prosecutors argued that Eddie and Elise staged the video to strengthen a lawsuit against the Navy and to collect life insurance money. On the night of May 14, 1996, Quincy was invited to the Makdessi home. What he did not know was that he was walking into a trap. According to the prosecutors, Eddie fatally shot Quincy as soon as he arrived. Then, to tie up loose ends, he turned on Elise, ending her life in a brutal attack. Eddie claimed that it was self-defense, saying Quincy had attacked Elise and he intervened. But the blood evidence and the way Elise was bound proved otherwise. After the crime, Eddie fled the U.S. Despite the best efforts of the detectives, they could not find him and the case went cold. A decade later, he resurfaced in Russia trying to start over. He was then caught and extradited back to Virginia to face trial. In 2006, Eddie stood before a jury. The prosecutors laid out their case. Eddie had plotted the attacks for financial gain using Elise's false accusations as a setup. The jury found him guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. Eddie was sentenced to life in prison and ordered to pay over $200,000 in fines. The case leaves people wondering, was Elise a willing partner in Eddie's scheme, or was she manipulated by him? Did she know Quincy would be murdered that night, or was she expecting something very different? What is certain is that 2 lives were cut short, and Eddie Makdessi will spend the rest of his life behind bars.